You're listening to episode 275 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Innen Parchelo speaks with us about the interbeing of contemplative walking. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I would like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the Contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page. And if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us on the conversation. Chances are, if you are on a silent meditation retreat, primary focus may be sitting practice. Not just on retreats either. Sitting has a dominant focus in contemplative practice, interspersed with periods of short walking, which seem geared to loosen up the body in order to support more sitting. Walking and other movement practices themselves have more to them than just relief for stressed joints, with a little exposure to mindful awareness of lifting, placing, shifting. Instead, contemplative walking can be a heartwood of practice. Innen Parchelo has studied, taught, and practiced Buddhism for more than 50 years. He is Canada's first Tendai priest and acts as both the priest to the Red Maple Tendai Sangha and director of Tendai Canada. He is the coordinator of Red Maple Center for Mindful Living and of the Padakun Center for Contemplative Walking. He began his formal Dharma practice in 1974 and has been a member of several Buddhist centers, first taking refuge in 1994. In 2008, he renewed his refuge vows and in 2010 was ordained as a Tendai priest. Special thanks to John Negru of Sumeru Press for help with today's interview. So sit back, relax, and have a nice cloud walking tea. Our guest today is Innen Parchelo. Ray, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ted. Nice to be here.
So glad to have you here. And let's just dive right in. Have you tell us about your background?
Okay. I kind of have two main backgrounds that really intersect and interact over the years. On the one hand, professionally, as I was saying earlier, I just retired from being a direct service social work counselor, but did that for about 35 years and lots of experience in working with people in rural community on a wide range of ideas. So that's one thing that I bring to it. And the other is lifelong involvement with the Buddhist community. And I've been involved with different sanghas over the years. Right now, I lead a group which is called the Red Maple Tendai Sangha, and we are the main practice group for Tendai Canada, which is the Canadian version of International Tendai. It's one of the smaller but most venerable of the Japanese Buddhist traditions.
So really our main topic today is contemplative walking. And one of the things that I find very rich about walking is that it's not just another option in a toolkit. It's not a technique of meditative practice, although there's certainly that as a way of learning it initially. But you don't see it that way either. And I'm wondering if you could say some about the tremendous value of contemplative walking.
Sure. The whole idea of contemplative walking it's kind of a term that I coined to distinguish walking as it's related to meditation, reflection, contemplation, as distinct from the fitness-related styles of walking, even race walking. So I wanted to tap into what I see as a huge tradition across all religious faiths of using walking. I mean, pilgrimage is the most obvious example, but how different religious traditions use walking as a spiritual practice, and that it's not simply something that, well, I'm tired of sitting, I'm tired of prayer, I'm tired of whatever, I'm going to get up and walk. I read that all the time, and it does serve that purpose for sure, but it's way, way richer and way deeper than that. I guess where I'm with it conceptually now is I think about stationary contemplative practices at one end of the continuum and movement-related practices, primarily walking, at another end, and they complement each other. One brings things that the other doesn't.
Yeah, I agree completely. It's often, and certainly in my background in Zen, that I mistakenly approached walking meditation initially. This is not the fault of my teachers, it's on me, that walking was a break from sitting. You do your 40 minutes of Zazen, and then you do your 10 minutes of walking to kind of stretch a little bit, and you'd be in a crowded room on a retreat, and so there was some awareness of others, but it was more about having a break from sitting. And then you'd be going back to sitting for 40 minutes, but it became so much more than that. And what I'm wondering is that since walking isn't just something to be learned by rote, I'm wondering if you could describe another perspective of some of the depths of the value of contemplative walking and movement.
Well, it isn't something that you learn by rote any more than the sitting practice. I mean, for yourself, if you've done Zazen practice, that it's not enough to take up space. It's not enough to just sit there and stare at the wall. Something else is going on. And so it's very much a process of engaging in the same way that we do when we're doing sitting practice, because I have a Zen background as well. In the same way that, when we're sitting, we're engaging with the whole body. We're engaging with, as one of my old teachers used to say, the space of attention. So we place ourselves in the space that we're practicing in. So walking is not different in that way. And I think that what I've been working with is the ways that movement practices bring us in touch with things that are less available to us, or less easily available, let me say, than when we're doing sitting practice. So sight, sound, smells, all the sense stuff that we have around us. And so, of course, we're not to tune out or to block that stuff. That can be a bit difficult when you're doing sitting practice, but you can't do that when you're walking. You can't tune out the feeling of your feet on the ground, the smell of flowers and trees, the sounds of birds, and so on. And I think that this became very clear to me in my own practice when I started to take my practice out of the Zendo. And, I got to a point where, the teachers would say, you have to make this a piece of your everyday life. You have to bring your insight and your questioning. You think about koan practice and that kind of stuff. It's not enough to be doing that when you're sitting. You have to be working the koan or working the wadu, when you're making your breakfast or you're having a shower, when, as I found, when you're having a wa. So I started to do that and realized there was a tremendous amount of insightful kind of material that was coming while I was walking. I'd always been a great walker anyway, but it allowed me to, what's the word? Justify is not the right word, but maybe validate. Is that, like a lot of meditative people, I mistakenly got the message that if I wasn't sitting on my butt in the Zendo, it wasn't real practice. But after some years of experimenting with bringing my meditative practice out into the world, out into the forest, and fields and paths and stuff like that, I realized, this is very solid, very valuable practice that, as I said earlier, I began to realize then that the contemplative walking complemented what I was doing on the mat, and vice versa too. It's not a one-way thing, that one informs the other.
You make an interesting distinction on the website. You talk about this subtle, perhaps profound difference between the experience of interbeing fostered in contemplative walking, which is a bit different than interconnection. I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about that.
For me, interbeing goes back to Thich Nhat Hanh and that kind of idea of interpenetration and so on, which is very much my tradition, the Japanese tradition, where we're very much aware of ourselves in our environment, and that, as the saying goes, mountains and rivers are as much the presence of the Buddha as anything. And so when I'm walking, I think when one is walking, one has an opportunity to make a full kind of sensory engagement with the environment, with the natural world. And for example, a rough example, oftentimes, very often, I'm out walking with my dog, the legendary Joshua. And I walk with him. He's a small dog, but he's very energetic and very playful. And I don't walk him on leash very much when we're out and about. So I get an opportunity to experience what he's doing. And there is this kind of interplay that he's a dog and his interests are dog-like. So when he stops and smells something, it suggests to me, stop and smell this. And so we kind of play off of each other. And I learn to experience the natural world in some ways the way that he does. And that's taught me to engage myself and to recognize myself in the smells, in the sights, in the sounds. And that as we come to learn in our mat and cushion based practice, this barrier that we think the skin surface, that what's on the inside is me and what's on the outside is not me, that we learn to break that down. You start to feel the people next to you, the space above, the hardness of the floor, and so on. And so it's bringing that same kind of sense of interpenetration on a very simple level into the walking practice. So a very important part of walking practice, what I teach people right from the get-go, is walk with your feet. Feel the feet. Walking is not a conceptual practice. You don't think about walking. You don't imagine you're walking. You feel, you bring your attention down the body, through the breath, into the hips, into the legs, into the feet. And when that heel hits the ground or the floor, wherever you're walking, that you feel that, you experience that. And so you are, in that sense, pushing your attention, your awareness into the environment, into the space. So that's part of what I'm getting at with the interbeing, is that it has to do with that engagement with the environment. It might be a natural or it might be an indoor environment.
Yeah, it seems that there is a greater depth, that with interconnection as a descriptor, there's still a separation. There's still a me and a that. And there's a connection, but the connection can exist between separate things. With interbeing, you're going a bit deeper.
Yeah, and at the risk of being overly mystical about it, one thing that I stress to people is that we're in a constant dialogue with the natural world. And, the smells, the movement, the quality of the light, those things are the natural world speaking to us. So there is a constant dialogue, a conversation going on. And so while we're walking, we have an opportunity to listen to what the natural world is telling us. It's not speaking in words, but it's communicating something with us. And there's new research going on. I was listening to a radio program the other day, new research about how plants and trees and so on communicate with each other. There is a kind of dialogue that goes on between plants and animals, and we're part of that, I think.
Yep. I remember reading The Secret Lives of Trees, Secret Lives of Plants, that goes into that. So, Ray, can you tell us a bit about, in your own practice personally, what you've found, what some of the things that have stood out for you with contemplative walking?
Okay, so in my tradition, in the Tendai tradition, one of those characteristic things about Tendai is this expression we use of 10,000 practices, and that all kinds of practices are valid. And so within Tendai, we're taught all kinds of different practices. That's one of the things that inspired the book, the Walk Like a Mountain book, and that we can use all kinds of different practices, and there is no hierarchy with practice, that walking for some people, for some practitioners, may be the most powerful thing. So over the years, I shifted into that. I found that for me to be the most powerful. And it takes a multitude of forms for me and for anybody who wants to follow that. So as a practitioner, somebody who leads a weekly Sangha practice, we always do walking. We sit, we do contemplative, we do ritual practices, mandala mantra, that kind of stuff. But we always incorporate walking practice, indoor walking. And so part of my walking practice is learning to refine and to deepen that indoor, what we know as Kinhin style walking. So just walking, as it's called, and really refining that. And that's taken me several years to understand that there's a subtlety and a refinement to walking practice that's every bit as demanding and every bit as rich as any kind of Zazen practice. There is a form of walking which is as demanding as the full lotus position in a sitting practice. So it's not just a matter of slumping around the zendo in between sitting periods. It is every bit as demanding and enriching. But on the other hand, I do all kinds of outdoor walking. I do trail walking. I lead a trail walking group. I do solo walking on my own. I do it with my dog. Sometimes it's slow, counting the breath, mantra recitation kind of practice. Sometimes it's brisker. I do experiment with a little bit of speed walking. I found that really interesting. In a sense, doing that, I forget what they call it in the Rinzai tradition, but where there is that really, really fast walking where you tear zendo.
Crazy walking. Yeah, we do it in mindfulness as well.
So, I use a bit of that when I'm walking out of doors. It's not wild. It's just fast. It's really enthusiastic. And that's interesting in its own way, to get the body just tearing along on the landscape. And it's a bit like riding in a bus, you're moving very fast, but it allows you to be mentally aware of what it is you're observing from a calmer kind of place. So yes, the body is moving, but the mind is taking it all in a very slow, calm way.
So you made mention of this, and it's one of the things we want to talk about is the book, Walk Like a Mountain. Tell us about that.
Okay, that came about, maybe 6-7 years ago, partly, as I said, out of my involvement with the Tendai tradition, Tendai Shu, where I understood how legitimate walking was and how rich Tendai was with walking practices. So I wanted to do a really thorough investigation of all of the different forms within Tendai, and that got me interested in forms of practice outside of Tendai. So the book Walk Like a Mountain, it's subtitled The Handbook of Buddhist Walking Practices. It's a Sumero book, and I don't mind plugging it. And it lists about 12, 15 Buddhist practices that range from that slow Kinhin-style walking, indoor walking, up to what I consider to be the most difficult, demanding, spiritual, physical walking practice ever developed, which is the Kaihogyo practice that's practiced within in Tendai. It has different versions, but it can be 100 days of a walking marathon, 25 kilometers, 26 kilometers every day for 100 days. It's hugely demanding. And it's so demanding that you have to get special permission to try it. It can be life-threatening. It's just so difficult. Not many people do it, and I certainly don't recommend it for very many people. I don't do it myself, but I've met people who have done it, and so we have this huge continuum of different walking practices. And so what I wanted to do with the book was to document all these different practices, to begin to compare and contrast, and to flesh out this idea of walking as a contemplative practice. And the book really concludes with asking that question of, is walking simply just another thing that we do, or does it bring distinct, unique value to us as meditative, contemplative people? So that's where it's brought me. And so the book really allowed me to kind of flesh all of that out and introduce those categories and document the different walking forms. Now, I don't just stay with, although it's called the Handbook of Buddhist Walking Practice, I do take it beyond that. So I look at the origins of, say, for example, walking as a social action project. So going back to people like Gandhi, his famous salt walk. How did people start to use walking? Looking at walking in the sense of pilgrimage, and every tradition in the world has pilgrimage. Looking at walking as this kind of initiation process. So looking at, or at least introducing how different religious traditions use walking as part of their initiation. So I really just tried to shake out as many forms as I could. Prayer walking is another good one. So just really trying to lay out the territory, because as I mentioned in the book, and I sometimes get tired of saying this to people, but no one has taken the time, no one's given the effort to investigate walking as a contemplative practice. It's usually seen as a fitness activity or as a nice recreational activity, but no one has taken a systematic perspective on all the different forms of walking and this idea of the complementary relationship between walking as a movement practice and the stationary tradition.
And out of that has grown the Padukun Center of Contemplative Walking. Tell us about that.
Okay, so again, in the book, at the end of the book, I played with a bunch of possibilities of where this investigation could go, and it led me to establishing the Padukun Center for Contemplative Walking, which is it's relatively new thing. We're about to become a nonprofit organization, but it's really something I just formed in its most solid way when I retired last year. And so Padukun is concerned with investigating contemplative walking from four perspectives. One is moving out of the book, developing a really coherent theory of contemplative walking. So looking at what is contemplation? That in itself is an interesting question, but how is contemplative walking related to this broader field of contemplation? So generating a theory of contemplative walking. And so I'm starting to write about that. There's a follow-up book in process. We'll be starting a journal of contemplative walking later this year. So the theoretical part of it is part of it. The second part is what I call sharing experience. So I'm trying to document as many experiences of people as contemplative walkers. So talking to people who do pilgrimages of all kinds, talking with people who do the sort of formal kinhin thing. But also there's a lot of people who don't relate it to, and I hate to say that, not religious but spiritual kind of experience. But there are a lot of people who use walking just as a way of connecting with their spiritual lives. So I'm beginning to do what I call podcasts. We call them podcasts. And so interviewing people about their walking experience. What do you learn from walking? What happens to you? Why do you do it? How does that relate to prayer and meditation and so on? So this gathering of personal experience is a big part of it. The third part that Podican is about is cultivating the forms of walking. So we've been doing workshops and stuff for several years, teaching people contemplative walking practices, indoor, outdoor, long practices, short practices. And so I'm starting to create some formal workshops and so on, training materials beyond what's in the book, because the Walk Like a Mountain book is a handbook. There is a lot of instructional material about how do you properly do it. So developing practice material. And then the fourth thing is a new area that has come out from the book, but really starting to make more sense of it now is this whole area of walking in relation to social action. You and I both know about within the last 6 months, the women's walk, the walk for science, the peace walks, going back to Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, and so on. Walking is used very much as part of the social action movement, and it also has inspired a lot of social action. You think about John Muir and the whole outdoor movement. So I think that's a really interesting thing too, is how do we marry more obviously the practices of walking with principles of social action? Why do people do this? Talking to people who are doing these walks, why a walk? Why are you doing the walk? What's unique about a walk that expresses your social conscience? So those are the 4 areas that we're really concerned with.
Excellent. For folks who are interested in finding out more about this, including a lovely graphic about what was just described, you can go to the website, which is linked on the episode page for this episode, www.padakun.com.
Padakun. It's a bit of a mashup of the Sanskrit word padakan, which means the Buddha's footprint. So I chose that as a word that is really resonates with me in terms of walking and Dharma. So padakun.com, and there's links there also to a blog site where we'll try to have a typical kind of blog commentary. And in future, as I said, we'll have our audio and in future video podcasts. We're developing this more academic style kind of journal of contemplative studies, where I'm aspiring to get some of the writers that I know who are doing interesting work on writing to contribute to this field. I really want to try to cultivate a whole new study of contemplative walking. I'm not sure if I'd mentioned to you, but I had been down to the International Symposium on Contemplative Studies in San Diego last year and had the opportunity to introduce my work into that forum. And I really want to try to make that part of that conversation of contemplative studies.
Excellent. Our guest today, Innen Ray Parchelo. Ray, thank you so much for being here.
It's been such a pleasure. And, as you mentioned, if anybody wants more information, or, the other thing that I encourage people to do, if you have a story to tell about contemplative walking, send me that information. I'd love to do an interview. I'd love to document some of your experience. And that's how this whole field is going to grow.
thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.